Welcome to this presentation, which is designed to help children's education and care services adapt their menus while they deal with ingredient shortages brought on by the current COVID-19 stockpiling panic. This has been presented by the Australian Childcare Alliance and prepared by UnYucky, a consultancy for education, food and families. What we're going to cover will be what's happening with your food supplies, ingredient swaps and meal swaps, whether there might even be some benefits for your service that you can find in this situation. Check your compliance with the national law, regulation and quality standard. Consider whether you need to stockpile at your service at all in a response, and point you to additional resources and how to get more help. So, hi, I'm Beck Lloyd. I'm an education and food writer, and I know this sector pretty well. What's more, I literally wrote a book about staying sane in the kitchen and dealing with dramas like missing ingredients. The Australian Childcare Alliance asked me to help out because many of its members are struggling currently with food shortages and menu disruptions. We're going to get you some great ideas to help your kitchen stay safe, healthy and compliant until things settle down. But before we even begin that, here's an important message. Don't panic. That's right. Wash your hands as often as you should, stay calm and be kind to each other and the people at the supermarket. Read the official health department advice and definitely don't get your information from somebody's uncle on Facebook. If you've got a box of face masks already at home, please consider giving them to your local GP instead. So seriously, don't you panic, because what we're doing now is looking at what's happened when other people panicked. That's right. What happened in March 2020 was that with the declaration of pandemic status for COVID-19, economists pointed to herd behaviour and the media called it panic shopping. Official advice is really, in the worst case, you need maybe 2 weeks of supplies at home if you are personally quarantined. But when you're in a panic, I suppose the facts don't matter, and a lot of people seem to have bought far more than they could possibly need, which has had an effect on the shopping for early learning centres, school canteens and OSH or USH services in a number of ways. You might be missing your regular delivery slot, which has really thrown your whole menu out of whack. Or maybe you got your delivery and you are missing items, or you've received purchase limits on items where you need far more than the quantity provided. Or visiting a supermarket in person, you've come up with the same problems. So what can you do? Well, let's look at your existing suppliers first, and it really is expected to settle down. There is no suggestion that there are long-term issues with the supply chain for food in Australia. Another thing to remember is that the people who are most likely to do that major panic buying have already shopped. They've got their first big haul back home now, and while they may keep going back for more, it's likely to be in much more reasonable quantities in future. And remember that most stockpilers won't be hoarding fresh foods like cauliflower, bananas or bread. While it may be less convenient for you and take a bit more time in the short term, it's not going to do you harm in the long term to have to swap some of those things for fresh ingredients in some of the ways we'll suggest now. However, all of this could take a while to settle down. What can you do in the meantime? Well, before we get to swapping things, you could have a look at who your suppliers are, including looking locally. Butchers, bakers, fruit and vegetable shops are everywhere, and it could be that they become your new best friend in the current situation. You may not be able to do separate individual small business shopping as a normal situation, but for now, you might even be able to sweet talk some of these people into delivering for you. And don't forget that you've got other opportunities for unusual things as well. I have seen plenty of convenience stores attached to service stations that have rice milk in the fridge cabinets, for example, and tinned chickpeas, even in smaller size tins, on the shelves. So be open to where you could find things right around your local area. At the other end, some people have reported success ordering things like bulk pallets of tin food or stacks of tin food and cleaning supplies through Amazon, Kogan and other big online warehouse stores. just take a look at what their delivery times are before you commit and what their delivery costs are going to be too. Also, take a look at market box delivery services in your region. There are many, many small businesses doing this now with the home delivery of boxes of fruit and vegetables, but also other supplies. You could find things like baking supplies, dry pasta, dry rice. Lots of things could come through from some of those market food delivery services. So if you're not sure where to go, you can just search online, or if you want to narrow it down, maybe jump onto Facebook Marketplace and have a look at services in your area, because you can narrow it down a bit by location, and also Gumtree, where a lot of these kinds of small businesses will advertise, and you can search by postcode. Now, this next section, we're getting into ingredient substitutes. We're going to be looking at some of the swaps that you can make and what might be involved in work for you in making those swaps. The first example I'm breaking down in some detail just to get you into the right mindset, and then we'll go in a bit faster after that. First one up is tinned tomatoes, one of the all-time great long life ingredients. You can store them away. You can use them for everything from pasta to curries and soups. They're a personal favorite of mine. I love getting the whole tomatoes in juice, because you can just squish up those whole tomatoes into a saucepan, and voila, with a little bit of extra effort, that's a pasta sauce. But now, to our horror, they may have become an out of stock or a limited purchase item in your delivery manifest. What can you do? Well, the good news is, at this point of the year, late summer, early autumn, there are plenty of fresh tomatoes in the shops, and they are also at peak season and often much cheaper than they will be at the rest of the year. But you don't have time to make a fresh tomato sauce, or do you? Well, obviously, I think you do. But I appreciate that we need to make sure that this is as easy for you as possible. So what we're after here is a way of converting fresh tomatoes into the convenience of tinned ones. That means three things. It's got to be low maintenance, low mess preparation. That means none of that finicky peeling, de-seeding nonsense that you get in a lot of chefy recipes for pasta sauces. The result's got to be runny enough that you can use it without having a long cooking time. And you've got to be able to store what you've got in batches so that you can use it more than once. Now, I'll give you 3 easy methods in a minute, and each of them is going to deliver on all of those requirements. But first of all, how many fresh tomatoes do you need to replace tinned tomatoes in your recipes at work? Well, unlike some other canned foods, you actually don't lose a lot of weight when you tip tinned tomatoes out into a bowl or a pan. So the calculation I'm doing here is based on some measuring, um, checking against what the internet said the measurements are, and it's pretty accurate. 5 medium round tomatoes in Australian terms weighs around 450 grams. You can see an example there of the size. That's a little bit more than the contents of a 400-gram tin of chopped tomatoes, which comes with about 380 grams of fruit and juice inside it. They both yield, however, almost exactly 2 cups of puree when you blend them. Now, that's the important thing, because it's the sauce component of the tinned tomatoes that is vital for your recipe. It's what you actually need to calculate your swap. Now, the easiest way to calculate that is to remember that you're going to need 1 kilogram of fresh tomatoes to replace either 2 standard 400-gram tins or 1 large 800-gram tin. 900 grams to a kilogram of fresh tomatoes to replace 2 smaller tins or 1 big tin. If you normally buy, say, 10 standard tins, you'll need about 5 kilograms of fresh tomatoes to replace the quantity. Now remember, if you can still get some tinned tomatoes, just not as many as you want, there's nothing wrong with mixing up the combination of fresh pureed tomatoes with the tinned tomatoes that you've got. And you can do that by following the same proportions that I've provided here. Now, into preparation, and this might sound really obvious to some people, and I apologize, but a surprising number of us don't realize that we can be this basic and get a great result. All you need to do is to quarter up some fresh tomatoes, removing only any of the green or woody stems. So you do that, you put them in a blender, or you put them in a big bowl or a pot with your stick blender, and whiz them up, and that is a perfect substitute for your tin tomatoes or tomato passata, or even jars of tomato sauce. Now, tomato pasta sauce. Now, the skins, the seeds, and those white cores down the center of a tomato will virtually disappear when you blend them. And in fact, you need to keep the seeds in because they contain a lot of natural pectin, and that helps your sauces to thicken up when you do cook with them afterwards. You can use any tomato this way. Roma tomatoes are great. They're also called egg tomatoes or plum tomatoes, but the normal round truss or salad tomatoes are fine too. You can even use cherry tomatoes in this mix. Method number 2. If you want a deeper flavor than just the blitzing raw tomatoes, a very low maintenance way to do that is to put some baking paper onto your oven trays, halve the tomatoes, and place them on the baking paper, cut side up, drizzle them with a little olive or vegetable oil, and roast them at a very low heat for an hour or longer if you want. So you're not trying to dry them out. What you're doing is you're roasting them so that they soften and intensify in flavor. If you want to get them out as quickly as you can take them out after even 15 minutes. But if you want a really intense sweet flavor and you don't mind just leaving them sitting in the oven while you're working on other things, leave them until they're actually starting to collapse down onto the baking paper and there's a bit of juice running out of them as well. And that will give you a really beautiful tomato base for any kind of use that you would ordinarily have for tin tomatoes. Method 3 is our buddy, the slow cooker. Now, you may not have one, but a lot of services do have them now. They aren't expensive and they do a great job for bulk cooking in kitchens. If you're doing a very large number of children, they're often quite a versatile, a flexible way of fitting in 3 or 4 even slow cookers I've seen in kitchens when you're doing for large numbers. Now, it's a bit more set and forget this one, but there is potentially a bit more washing up at the other end. Cut your tomatoes, and I would suggest with a slow cooker you cut them in very thin slices because it's going to help them to cook more evenly and more quickly within the slow cooker framework. If you are wanting to just get the plain tomatoes out, you can do it in probably as little as I'd say 2 hours. And you might want to blend them then to get them nice and smooth. If you leave them there for 4 hours, you're probably going to find the only reason to blend them would be to chop up the seeds and the skins a bit more, what's remaining after that kind of cook. You could also take advantage of your slow cooker to not only add the tomatoes, but also add in some sauteed garlic and onions and a nice big batch of stock. And when you are finished with the tomatoes cooking, blend it with a stick blender, and you could make use of that for, it could be soup immediately, it could be the base for a pasta sauce, it could be going into your mincemeat for bolognese, it could be stored away in your freezer as a base for a dozen other casseroles or curries in the future. So really versatile way of making use of that slow cooker. Now, each of these methods, fresh, roasted, or slow cooked, will give you a slightly different flavour outcome, but not enough to limit the way that you use them later, which is what we wanted. If you only need to store them for a few days, you can put the cooled blended tomatoes into any sealed container and refrigerate them. If you want to be really clever with that, you can pour a little layer of oil over the top that really helps to block off the oxygen in those sealed containers, keeps them super fresh. The blended mix will freeze very well, however, so this is also an opportunity to get the very best of the late summer tomatoes and make up big batches that are ready for the cooler months ahead. And what if you can't get fresh tomatoes, or what if you just can't get back out to the shops? You've already been messing around trying to fix up this missing order and you don't have any more time for that. Well, it's also an opportunity to step right away from your basic tomato sources and think, what other vegetables do you have that could be good with the same kinds of purposes as a tinned tomato? You could, for example, cook some pumpkin and sweet potato in stock and puree it, and that makes a lovely colourful sauce to go over pasta with children. You could serve pasta with no sauce, just with tossed with some sautéed grated vegetables, including things like grated broccoli stems, which really, really lovely when you put them with pasta. Or you could give something like this no-mato sauce recipe from food.com a try. Now, I guarantee in any children's service, there will be some little ones and some adults who do not like tomatoes. So this kind of recipe is a good way of extending your repertoire anyway, and maybe share it with your families too. Now, moving on to rice that might be missing in your kitchen order. The most obvious replacement for rice is cauliflower rice. And you can look up any one of 100,000 different cauliflower rice recipes. The basic principle is cut up a fresh cauliflower into bite-sized pieces. Try and keep them around the same size because that does make a difference in the processing. Then you put them in a food processor or a blender and you whiz them until they are small like rice grains and a crumbly kind of look. You see there on the bottom left of the screen the effect that you're after. Or if you don't have time for that amount of prep, but you can get back to the supermarket, look in the freezer section for veggie rice from cauliflower or even from broccoli, which can work quite well too. And if you do happen to want to explore this further, there are some amazing recipes out there. And even in my book, the Flawsome Family Meal Book, I've got a cauliflower fried rice recipe that was written by an early childhood education centre director. So maybe check that one out. Pasta is another staple people have reported missing. Now, if you had committed to spaghetti in your current menu cycle and you didn't get it in your order, maybe now is the time to try zucchini as noodles, or zoodles as they're called. You can find inexpensive zoodling devices, generally called spiralizers, in Kmart or Target and stores like that. And sometimes even the automatic attachments for stand mixers like KitchenAid and Kenwood will come with spiralizers. That's a longer term choice. Now, depending on the design of the spiralizer that you get, you could perhaps offer educators the chance to let the children help make the spiralized zoodles. The way it works is very similar to the Apple Slinky machines, which kids absolutely love and adore, and it's a lot of fun for them to do. However, having said that, it's also increasingly easy to find pre-zoodled bags of noodles in supermarkets near the bag salads or even in the freezer. Or skip the idea of long noodles at all this week, and if you don't even have short pasta shapes, chop up zucchini into bite-sized wedges and steam it and serve that underneath pasta rather than as part of the pasta sauce as you may be used to doing. Zucchini has a similar pale colour and consistency to soft pasta, and to most people it doesn't have a strong smell or flavour. You can always serve it on the side for children who are reluctant. Now, homemade lasagna is a thing of beauty, and if it wasn't on your menu and you can't get the lasagna sheets, you have all my sympathy. Here are some great substitute ideas from Australian sites taste.com.au and mamabake.com. Both of them suggest using ordinary bread wraps in place of lasagna sheets. At this stage, they seem to be in good supply, so it's a great chance to give it a try. While the taste.com.au search term I've suggested on this screen says tortillas, you could also, they don't have to be the specialty tortillas. You could also use any kind of wrap wherever a tortilla comes through, or a really thin flatbread. Now, you can use those in any sort of Italian recipe around lasagnas or cannellonis, or as we've shown here, a Mexican lasagna, which combines the principle of layering from a lasagna with the kinds of fillings and flavorings that you get from Mexican foods to make a fun dish that will tick a lot of boxes for children. Chickpeas. Now, cooked and canned chickpeas are a staple in many children's services menus these days, but unfortunately they have also featured on a lot of stockpiler menus, and supermarkets have run out in some cases or placed purchase limits on the convenient cooked tinned version. Depending on your recipe, you could replace them with butter beans, cannellini beans, sometimes just sold as plain white beans, are really good at providing a creamy consistency if that is what your chickpea recipe was about. They make great dip, for example. Lentils are a really good option if you were going to add chickpeas into a sauce like a curry. You can buy them in tins already cooked, or the split dried version will cook really fast. And lentils they have an undeserved bad reputation with some people, so you're probably not going to find them running out as fast as chickpeas will. You could use kidney beans or black beans. They find them cooked in cans, and they will hold their shape better than the white beans. So if you were doing something like a chickpea salad and you want the bean part of it to hold its shape, they'd be a good option for you. Potatoes, sweet potato or rice, they might not provide that little extra hit of protein that the legumes do, but depending on your recipe, if you've got those things on hand, they could work out as a substitute if your order came up short. Now, maybe you don't have anything that can substitute and you need to look at something that is definitely of the chickpea variety. You could cook them from scratch. Now, it's one of those things that seems very intimidating until you actually do it. But if you can get dried chickpeas, one of the biggest challenges you're going to face is working out how much you need. Now, 1 cup of dry will make 3 cups cooked. If you think about that in terms of replacing a tin of chickpeas, typically you get 1.5 cups of actual chickpeas within a tin. Now, if you normally need 10 tins of chickpeas, that's 15 cups. So you'll need 5 cups of dried to replace the volume. However, if you're going to buy them by weight, which is often the case through a health food store or in pre-weighed packets in supermarkets, they will be a different form of maths. I'm sorry. Typically, chickpea weight doubles in cooking because they absorb so much water. In the standard 400-gram can, you'll get about 250 grams of chickpeas. To make up 10 tins of cooked chickpeas, you need to create 2.5 kilograms cooked, which means 1.25 kilograms dried. Now, from a supermarket, your choice is usually a 375-gram pre-weighed bag, so you'd need at least 3 of those to make up the 10 tins missing from your order. And again, I'm sorry, I am sorry. That was so much maths, and I don't want to throw all of that at you. But needed to cover both the volume and the weight. Mostly, however, you're going to be doing something like this. To get 10 tins of cooked chickpeas, to get the result of 10 tins of cooked chickpeas, you need to buy 3 bags of the 375-gram size. Or if you can get a kilogram bag, that would substitute for 10 tins cooked quite well too. So now how to actually cook them. Look, you can get these instructions easily online, and if you don't see something that works for you here, by all means go. I have just reduced the instructions by taking out some unnecessary steps for what you want in a lot of the online processes. But here are 4 ways. First one up, this often puts people off, the overnight soak in cold water. If you soak at least 2 times the volume of cold water for 8 to 12 hours or overnight, what that effectively means is put them in a nice big container with plenty of cold water. Remember, they're going to triple in size when they soak. Do that before you go home, and then the next morning they're ready for the next stage of preparation. And it's really easy. Put a cover over it. If you can, even Glad wrap would do the job. And make sure that there's plenty of water. If you don't have time for overnight cooking and you've got a stove in your kitchen, you can do it this way. You can take your quantity of chickpeas, put them in a saucepan, cover them with at least 2 times that amount of cold water, bring it to a boil, turn the heat down to a simmer and leave it going for at least 45 minutes. Now, that gets you from dried to cooked, but there's a warning. Dried chickpeas take longer to cook the longer they were dried before you bought them, and there is no real way to find that out. So the 45 minutes is the minimum. It could take an hour, it could take an hour and a half. So give yourself plenty of wriggle room there. When you get to the 45-minute mark, maybe if they're not ready, top up the water with some hot water and just keep checking every 10 to 15 minutes or so to see whether they're getting tender yet. If you've got a pressure cooker, follow the pressure cooker instructions, because you can get from a packet of dried chickpeas to a good quantity of cooked, not just soaked, but cooked chickpeas within an hour with a pressure cooker. But do find your manufacturer's instructions for Instapots, multi-cookers and pressure cookers. Find your manufacturer's instructions and follow those carefully. And back to our friend, the slow cooker. Again, look for the manufacturer's instructions or put them on after they've been soaked. So say you've done a big soaking batch under number 1 over there on the left. Say you've done a big soaking batch and you're storing some of them, bringing them out as you need them. Those ones will take about 3 hours to cook in a slow cooker, and you can add some really lovely flavors in there so that you're really contributing to your meal prep. If you have not done the overnight soak, you can combine that in the slow cooker process. So either you can use the slow cooker container to do the soaking overnight and then switch on the slow cooker in the morning with your extra flavors, or you can start first thing in the morning, putting your dried chickpeas in, covering them with plenty of cold water, and just running it on slow cooker for 6 to 8 hours if your shift covers that. And by the end of that time, you will have cooked chickpeas that, again, you can store in your own way. Now, there are some important tips. One is dried chickpeas. Yes, you really must check that there are no tiny stones or bits of debris in the packet. It doesn't happen often, but you don't want it to happen to you. The easiest thing is to take a big baking tray with 4 raised sides and pour in your dried chickpeas before you do anything else, and check for the little stones. The contrast between the chickpeas and the base of the baking tray is a really good way to spot anything that shouldn't be there. Another really important one, you should add a tablespoon of bicarb soda per 500 grams of chickpeas that you're soaking or soak plus cooking to help remove or soften the skins and improve the texture. Now, that is going to give you a result that is more like what you see in the canned chickpeas, where most of them, the skins have slipped off, and the skins that are there are just insignificant. They're very soft. It doesn't matter. It's not going to catch in anybody's teeth. And the third tip is just make sure, if you're going to this effort, if you've got the room to freeze them, do a plenty and batch them up. If you clearly label that some have been soaked but not cooked, others have been soaked and cooked, then you're going to be in really good stead. You might not even need to buy chickpeas for a while. Now, meat swaps and replacements. Meat, and particularly minced meat, is another ingredient that ACA members and other cooks have reported missing from their orders or from their supermarket shelves this month. Now, I hasten to say, not talking about all meat missing, just the meat that you wanted, the meat that you had allocated in your menu. Now, what we want to do is get you confident about swapping out without having to make radical meal changes. We'll start with the easiest option: white meat for white meat, red meat for red meat. Essentially, anything you can cook with pork mince, you can cook with chicken mince, and vice versa. Anything you can cook with beef mince, you can cook with lamb mince and kangaroo mince, and switch those around. You could even go further. You can things that you were going to cook with pork, you can cook with beef quite often. What the test is that I apply is to try it out in your imagination first. If you think what beef and lamb and pork and chicken, and if you're familiar with it, kangaroo, taste like and their texture, you can picture what it's going to be like in a dish that you don't normally use it. So if you normally only use, say, a pork and veal mince for meatballs or for your bolognese, imagine whether it feels right in your mind to use chicken or plain pork or plain beef or kangaroo even. There's certainly some big fans of kangaroo bolognese out there. And if your imagination says it's okay, it probably will be. Now, if kangaroo's a step too far, but you need something else, try turkey mince. It works for red meat and white meat recipes. You can cook just about anything that you can cook with mince, you can cook with turkey mince. Bolognese, sanctuary bao, sausage rolls. It's low in fat, high in protein, and it usually costs less than the other minced meat options too. As I mentioned earlier, if you do have time to look around, try your local butcher for replacing meats, particularly minced meats, or suggesting a different cut. Now, with something like chicken mince, for example, ring around, because if you couldn't get it at the supermarket and you're not used to seeing it in a butcher shop, I think you'll find that they'd be very happy to run it through the mincer for you and have it ready to pick up. Same for pork, same for beef, same for lamb. That is what they do. They're butchers. Another option is replace the meat altogether with a vegetarian choice. Now, you might already have some vegetarian days in your meal plan. It's okay to extend those, especially in a situation like this. Or if you've got meat but not as much as you wanted, look at your recipes and see, do you need that quantity? Could you meet the nutritional requirements of the children by halving the meat in a recipe and including additional protein, say from legumes or dairy, if those are options for the children that you're feeding? And in this respect, vegetarian and vegan recipe bloggers are your new best friends. And why do I say bloggers? Well, it's because they will usually give you far more story and background and explanation than a standard recipe site. Now, you may not need that, and that's fine. But if you're not confident about swapping out ingredients, I would say put in in your search bar the recipes that you are not feeling you're able to make with your current ingredients. And while you are searching, add in the word blog, and perhaps even vegetarian if meat is the problem, and see what comes up. I think you're going to find that you get a much nicer result that has a really good explanatory tone and a nice story to make you feel like it's going to be okay. Now, who'd have thought you would ever be short of tin tuna, right? It is one of the largest single ingredient sections on the supermarket shelves. However, the large unflavored tins of tuna that you normally need are being snapped up in some areas, and that means limits or missing tins in your order. What can you do? Well, first up, tinned or fresh salmon has a stronger flavor than tin tuna, and that means a little goes a lot further. If you can get tinned salmon, just make sure you crush it up really well. It does often get shipped with the skin that you'll want to probably peel off, but if not, Just make sure everything is mushed up really, really well, and that there are none of those little soft bones, or that you pick them out before it goes to the children. That's a bit finicky, and I would actually prefer to go with something like a smaller quantity of boneless fillets of fresh salmon. Now, fresh costs more, but a little bit goes much further. You pay about, for your tin tuna, $10 to $12 per kilo for a 400-gram tin. And you're paying $25 to $30 a kilo for fresh salmon. Now, 400 grams of fresh salmon is going to go a long way, so you can use less of it, and that means that it's not such a big difference in price after all. Funnily enough, if you can't get tin tuna but you can buy or cook chickpeas, their consistency is a good match for tuna in mornay's or creamier pasta sauces. So are butter beans, also sold as cannellini beans or plain white beans. But if you're planning to make fish cakes with your missing tin tuna, you could switch to potato or sweet potato cakes instead, and boost up the protein with cheese or another alternative, and boost the consistency by doing a mixture of mashed and grated potato and sweet potato. Or head to some of those vegan or vegetarian recipe websites we were just talking about and have a look for complete fish replacements. Tempeh or firm tofu and nori or another dried seafood. Nori is the sheets that you buy for sushi. Can be combined in all sorts of ways to give you that fishy flavour without the fish. And finally, in our ingredient swap hacks, it's not intended to be a food, but Play-Doh still does come from the kitchen order in many cases. If you've had to ration your flour because you can't get enough for the kitchen at present, you aren't alone in being the meanie in the kitchen. While it's not possible to make Play-Doh without any floury contribution, you might find it easier to get rice flour and corn at present. Rice flour and corn flour at present if your supermarket is short on the normal plain flour. We've adapted these two recipes from an allergy website to Australian measurements. You can pause the video to copy the ingredients, or just search for your own flour-free Play-Doh recipes online. And in case you're wondering, yes, you can definitely use self-raising flour for Play-Doh. Now, before we get into the other benefits, I really want to focus on reaching out to families. In a time like this, there is a real opportunity to communicate even more directly with families and keep building up your relationships. We brainstormed some ways that you could collaborate and work together, helping each other, because everybody may be experiencing similar issues to you. Like a good neighbour, could they share a cup of flour so that educators of their children can make the Play-Doh that they normally need? Better yet, they might save you another trip to the supermarket by picking up a spare pack of flour or a tin of tomatoes for $1 or so when they're there. You could start a conversation on your service's Facebook group or in your newsletter about substitutions for things that you've been missing at present. Tell the families what you're doing and ask them to share their own tips. Older members of families may have lived through hard times or wartime here or overseas, and they could have some unexpected advice. Now, you've probably asked before for families to share recipes and had mixed results, but this time you could really target your request to the meals that they make when they are low on supplies, like if they haven't managed to get to the supermarket this week. Many of us have a back of pantry recipe that we know we can make when we haven't got a chance to do the shopping, for example. Or if you've got a wholesale Costco supplier in the region, but your service isn't a member, you could do a shout out and see if any of your families have a card and are willing to have you reimburse them if they buy some extras for you on their next trip. And lastly, some of the substitutes that we've covered do involve just a bit more time, as much as we've tried to keep that down for you. It wouldn't hurt to ask if there is someone willing to volunteer for an hour one morning to give you a hand with food prep in this unusual situation. That kind of working side by side in the kitchen can be a really lovely bonding experience too. Now for the other bigger benefits from adversity. And I do not want to underestimate the stress that you've been feeling because of the disruptions to your planned menu. But let's see if we can turn that frown upside down now and take a look at some possible benefits of not having everything that you expected to use to feed all those lovely children. First of all, was it time for a shake-up anyway? Apart from anything else, it's the beginning of a new season. And while you may normally turn your menus over term by term, it's actually a really good idea to follow the seasons as much as you can. So this could be a chance to review it ahead of time. Another aspect of shaking up is that you've always got to balance providing really familiar and comforting food for children with foods that do challenge them a little bit and ask them to explore new ingredients and investigate. All language that you're going to find in the EYLF and My Time, Our Place as key learning outcomes for children. They need to be presented with some dishes that will extend their abilities and their interests and make them more competent eaters. So if you've been looking with horror at the need to suddenly shake up and worried about presenting children with new ingredients and new dishes at a more frequent rate than usual, it'd be a good time to treat that as a educational exercise and get the educators and educational leader involved in it as well. Really review that healthy eating program and policy and see how it's working for everybody. We've mentioned this a few times, but running out of tinned ingredients is just a great reason to use more fresh. Now, convenience is absolutely understandable and everybody does it, and it is not a criticism, but it's never going to do harm to put more fresh in. And if you have to do things that you haven't done before, like using fresh tomatoes instead of tin for a sauce when they're in season, and it worked out well for you and people liked it, maybe that becomes a permanent part of your menu. Another thing that I hope you'll take from here is exploring your local and regional suppliers. Now, again, buying from a supermarket is completely understandable, and of course you're going to keep doing it, but it is a bit like, if you pardon the food pun, putting all your eggs in one basket when it comes to situations like this. And let's face it, a viral panic isn't the only reason you end up with missing ingredients in your shopping trolley. There are always, or almost always, items going to be missing from your online order that you've got to top up. Maybe this is a chance to think about splitting your fruit or your veggie or your meat order with some local suppliers who are a bit more reliable and a bit more responsive to what you actually need. That would also potentially reduce the food miles that you're using, and that's a big tick for sustainability and environmental awareness in Quality Area 3. And you could perhaps end up arranging things like an excursion to some of these food suppliers, or incursions from the local butcher to come and talk to children about meat, or the local baker to talk about baking. And that is an educational program, Quality Area 1. And it's also building your community relationships, Quality Area 6. There's a lot of winning there. A lot of that also applies to those opportunities we just discussed for more parent communication. Now, there are opportunities galore in adversity for professional and personal development as a team and individuals. It's a time to band together and adapt and thrive. Pool your resources, pool your skills, and really recognize your cook too as part of your educational team. They offer so much more to children than just providing food if you allow them into the program. And a final benefit on professional networks is going through to groups like platforms like Facebook, looking for cooks clubs, for childcare cook groups, as they're often called in searches, even going through to some of the big family recipe sites and finding people who can help you when you've got a question about ingredients, a question about swapping or substituting items, and you may find that you get some very generous tribes to connect with over time that way too. Also, keep thinking about how adversity helps you to extend the national quality standard and the national quality framework right through your service and into your kitchen. For example, you don't have that time to chop up those 5 kilograms of tomatoes to get the sauce done before lunch. Perhaps an educator and some of the children with safety knives could deal with part of that for you. After all, it doesn't really matter if they're in perfect quarters before they go into a blender, does it? And while they're doing it, can you picture the educator being able to talk with them around things like the shapes, the colours, the numbers of people, the different textures, the way each little tiny seed grows into a plant, and how the cycle of life of plants works, how farmers operate, how food gets from where it's grown into the suburb or the town or the city where the children are. What's going to happen to it when it goes in the kitchen? Why will it look different when it's in a sauce? There is so much that comes out of those very simple cooking activities with children, and it can be helpful to you too right now. Now, what I find in working with children's services is that often the first impression, at least, people have is that the only real element from the national quality standard that contributes to the services ratings and programs is a dear old 2.1.3, healthy eating is promoted and appropriate for each child. I can tell you that just in this one presentation, I have come up with at least 10 different elements that you would meet if you followed some of these suggestions that we've provided here. It's a big set of ticks, and really I cannot emphasize enough the value of making the kitchen and the cook and the meal times with children a really positive, engaging part of your overall educational program and management of the service. Now, let's have a look at compliance, because I know some people are worried that changing their menu at short notice is going to lead to problems. Now, before we do this, it's a good time to remember, don't panic. You've got this. At a minimum, you have to continue to meet Regulation 79 and Regulation 80 and to consider the expectations that are set out in the Guide to the National Quality Framework. Regulation 79 is the one that says any foods or drinks you provide must be nutritious and adequate in quantity and take into account the dietary requirements of individual children, including each child's growth and development and any specific cultural, religious, or health requirements. Now, what that boils down to for you in this situation is, as long as you keep feeding the children well, it's okay. You can add additional vegetarian meals, and that's okay. You can switch out one kind of mincemeat for another, that's okay. You can switch out one cut of meat for another. You can take on additional new ingredients like cauliflower rice that you haven't done and introduce them to children for the first time. It is okay. Ideally, you'll keep meeting the Department of Health requirements or guidelines that are down in some states, like the red meat requirement in New South Wales. But if you're struggling with that in this fortnight or this month, remember that the only regulatory requirement is adequate, nutritious food, meeting individual requirements. You're going to be able to do that. You really are. What you need to avoid right now is picking up the phone, panicking, and ordering a month's worth of frozen yuck meals from the local party shop. You're going to be able to make good substitutes and swap meals around and continue a nutritious service that does cater for children's needs. Now, Regulation 80 says that your menu must exist and accurately describe the food and beverages available each day. Now, what this means is that if you have to change your plans between posting up your menu on a Monday and what's available to cook on the Thursday, in reality, then you need to adjust what you've published. Now, that could mean that you might have put it up on the communication software with parents. It might be out in your email newsletter. It might be in pigeonholes. It might be up on a whiteboard in the foyer. It might be that you have got it written out a month in advance even, and now you can't meet it. Whenever you change it, you have to update wherever you have posted it. So it could be some services and providers have a whole system of paperwork and forms that they kick into whenever they change the menu that sends everything out to parents and says, this is what we're doing now. Others just go up to the whiteboard in the foyer with the duster, wipe off the item, that the meal or the item that isn't there anymore, and adjust it so that it accurately reflects the food being served that day. Any of those approaches is fine. Remember, what the regulation wants is that you have a menu that people can see and that it accurately describes what's available each day. It doesn't say you can't ever change it. Now, the guide to the NQF is the document that brings the regulations and quality standard to life, and it tells you what an assessor or compliance officer would expect from you if they were to visit you today. That includes observing that written menus are being followed accurately, and that educational program planning includes things like healthy eating programs and cooking experiences. For example, that tomato chopping or zucchini zoodling comes right into that category. An assessor might also expect to see evidence of consultation with families about children's food requirements that goes further than the Regulation 79 health and cultural or religious needs. And the guide actually specifies children's likes and dislikes too. In the current situation where you might be presenting more new ingredients and more new meals than you normally would in a set period of time, I'd say that means just be very conscious of advising parents, particularly those whose children do have dietary requirements or who you know are particularly at the fussy end of the eating spectrum. It's another reason too to make sure that educators are engaged in any changes and that they are working with the kitchen to make this as successful as possible. So, how much food do you need to have on hand as a result of this stockpiling panic? You might be feeling the pressure right now to empty out that baby sandpit and fill it with every tin of tomatoes and chickpeas you can find, but you know that's not really the answer. Individual shoppers are usually stockpiling because they have a fear of being quarantined at home and being unable to get out for food, and we've got to say it at least once, toilet paper. Official advice is to prepare for a possible 2-week enclosure, not 6 months, not the apocalypse. In the words of a New South Wales police chief recently, this isn't the Thunderdome, it's not Mad Max. If your service, in the very worst case, had to close for a quarantine period, it would actually mean, if you think about it, you need less food, not more. And you're going to need a different kind of stock plan for reopening, like setting up an online order for delivery first thing that morning and moving on from there. That might mean that you have to make sure that more than one person's got access to the supermarket account details, for example. So, as far as a COVID-19 response goes, no, your service doesn't need to stockpile food. Longer term and later on, however, consider if this experience has given you a different view of your reliance on your supermarket orders. Now, we've talked about putting all your eggs in one basket. Maybe this is also time to do something like a risk assessment about your kitchen ordering and menu planning. You could look at questions like whether you're making full use of your available storage for long life foods like rice, flour, and tin goods, and whether your current equipment is up to the job of replacing ingredients in a situation like this. Or it could be something like considering investing in a vacuum sealer for foods so that you can store cold foods for longer and much more efficiently than you do in a typical childcare service kitchen. And we're here. What are your next steps? Well, getting in touch with your state Australian Childcare Alliance office is important for members. So the details are on the next and final slide. If you're an ACA member, you're entitled to a special printable download of this full presentation here, including many additional online recipe hacks and menu checking resources that I curated for you while I was preparing the video. You'll also get a member discount code for my book, The Flawsome Family Meal Book, if you want it. Your state office will tell you how to get access to all of that. And finally, please, if you need more help, contact me, Beck Lloyd at UnYucky.com, and I can give you one-to-one support for your cook, your team, or help you with organising workshops for your families to bring great food and positive meal times to life in your service. We could talk about that risk assessment for your meal planning procedures too. Thank you very much. And remember one more time, don't panic. You've got this. It'll be okay. Bye for now.